name is Reinhard Kraus, and I would like to welcome our viewers to this series of 3 interreligious webinars. I'm especially delighted that the webinars are a collaborative project between IslamiCity, the oldest and one of the world's largest informational websites about Islam, and the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies, where I serve as the executive director. Let me briefly introduce our participants. Rabbi Dr. Elliot Dorff is rector and professor of Jewish philosophy at American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Mr. Darb Tarifi is affiliated with the Islamic Center of Southern California and one of the pillars of the interreligious community in Southern California. Casey Crouch is in his final year of studies for a political science and religion degree at UCLA. Eliana Mastrangelo is a rabbinical student at American Jewish University also, and she's about to graduate and be ordained as a rabbi this year. And finally, Kenan Tawil serves as the program director for Muslim student life at Loyola Marymount University, also in Los Angeles. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are related religious traditions, but they're not the same. Tragically, the differences between our 3 traditions have led to much disagreement, conflict, and sometimes even bloodshed. Tragically, I say, because this spirit of animosity is a betrayal of the fundamental principles of our respective traditions. Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are each founded on teachings which call believers to respect and even to honor those who are not part of our own community. Specifically, how is a Jew to relate to non-Jews? What is a Christian to think of non-Christians? How is a Muslim to treat non-Muslims? To answer these questions is the purpose of our 3 webinars. Today, we begin with Judaism, the first historically of these 3 traditions. Dr. Dorff, what are the distinctive features of a Jewish theology of interfaith conflict?
One of the things I think that we need to recognize from the very beginning is the degree to which we have limited knowledge about everything. That doesn't mean they don't have some knowledge. We have knowledge about tables and chairs, but if I were to ask you to define what a table is, for example, and you were to tell me, for example, a flat surface with legs, I would ask you, well, what's the difference between that and a chair? And what about a table? You know, the tables in restaurants and a restaurant booth that is screwed into the wall that doesn't have legs. I mean, and we're just talking about a table, a simple thing like that, right? And let alone if I were to ask you, you know, what does a family mean? Or what does justice mean? Or what does truth mean, right? We're often running in terms of things that are very complicated, very fast. See, that's what a doctorate in philosophy does to you. It takes simple things and makes them very complicated. Well, if that's true in regard to concrete things like tables, chairs, people, stones, right? And if that, it's true even more for the next level. We human beings live on 3 different levels. We live on the level of concrete things like tables, chairs, people. Then we live on the level of first abstraction, things like justice and truth and beauty and family and community. These are all one level of abstraction above the concrete world. We don't literally see with our 5 senses a family, right? We see the members of the family maybe, but we don't see what a family is, let alone truth, right? We may see things that we think are true or false, and we may argue for their truth or falsity, but truth itself is something abstract, right? Or justice. I mean, the first major work in Western philosophy is Plato's Republic, which is one of the first of many discussions about what justice means. So that's the first level of abstraction. And then the second level of abstraction is even harder to, to try to articulate in words. That is the level of the ultimate reality, the container of it all, the transcendent, if you want to use that word, right? And the various philosophies of various philosophies in the world, secular philosophies, try to deal with describing the ultimate reality in a part of philosophy called metaphysics. And the goal of philosophy is to try to describe what is there. Religion, the very word religion, L-I-G, and the word religion, comes from the same Latin root from which we get the word ligament, which is connective tissue. It comes from the Latin ligare, meaning to bond or to connect. And the purpose of religion is not just to describe what's there, but to connect to what's there, to create connections to our families, our communities, to the environment, and to ultimate reality, and which we image in a whole variety of different ways, right? Now, when we come to the question of how do we respond to other religions, clearly we each have our own religion, and we're there in some cases because that's what our families have done for generations. Tradition, as Fiddler on the Roof put it, right? And in some cases, it's that plus we've thought a lot about it, and we really believe that its assertions are correct assertions. But if you believe that your religion is right, how can you believe that every other religion might be right too, right? Doesn't if you say that I think I'm a Jew not only by birth, and my family was Jewish, my ancestors, but I really thought a lot about it. And I've actually studied a lot of both the Western and the Eastern religions, as well as having a doctorate in Western philosophy. So, I mean, I've thought an awful lot about why am I a Jew and why am I particularly a conservative Jew, the middle movement within Judaism. And if so, and if that's the case, if I really am a committed Jew, I'm committed to my Jewish faith, how can I believe that anybody else might either be smart or moral or whatever? Well, the reason is because I've met all kinds of people who are not Jewish, who are both smart and moral. And so consequently, the question is, well, how do I understand that? And how did the Jewish tradition understand its relationship to non-Jews in a way that is both respectful and even so much so that you can even learn from them, while at the same time maintaining your own faith? I think there are at least three different reasons for that, and which I'm going to develop now. I wrote about them in a book that I did a while ago called To Do the Right and the Good, a Jewish Approach to Modern Social Ethics. And in chapter 2 of that book, I talk about how can there be pluralism within the Jewish community. If I'm a conservative Jew, how can I think that, what do I think about Orthodox Jews on my right and Reform Jews on my left and secular Jews altogether, right? How can I have any kind of relationship with them if I think they're just wrong, right? And then in chapter 3 of that book, I talk about how is it that I, as a Jew, might understand other religions as being both smart and moral for them, even though I myself am not a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Sikh or whatever, right? And maybe even to the point that I can learn from them. So I think there are three real reasons here. One of them is historical. I have to recognize that whatever the form of Judaism is that I practice and believe is something that has changed over time. That my tradition, and if you look at your traditions as well, are not the same as they were 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, or in my case, 4,000 years ago, right? That there have been real changes over time. So now I know that people who are, we all have a certain amount of the anal compulsive in us, and those of us who have more of it really don't like the notion of a dynamic tradition of a religion that has changed. But if we look at our tradition objectively, we have to recognize that these kinds of changes have occurred and really must occur if a religion is going to be relevant to new circumstances. You would hope that your religion is something that can change over time and can adapt to the new circumstances and the new scientific knowledge of our time, and the new moral concerns of our time, and the new economic pieces of our time, environmental issues, all of those things, right? You would hope that your religion would be able to change over time to be relevant to new circumstances. But if that's the case, then I have to recognize within my own tradition that new expressions of it may or may not be mine, but they may be something that in time to come will, will be triumphant, will be the ones that most Jews think of, right? As opposed to the one that I think is, in my own time, is the right way to understand Judaism and to practice it. And if that's true within my own religion, all the more so in regard to other people's religions, where I have to recognize that over time, these kinds of things have changed. And certainly the Jewish relationships, let's say to Christians, have changed radically in our time, with the Second Vatican Council among Catholics, with what the Lutherans did, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America did in 1996, in which it officially repudiated Luther's anti-Semitic comments. I mean, not a small thing for a church to do. And other religions have also begun to understand that we really need to be able to interact with each other in a respectful way, and not in a way that just simply dismisses the claims to truth and the claims to goodness of other religions. So that kind of historical evolutionary factor in every religion, I think, needs to remind us that whatever it is that I believe now and that I do now may or may not be the form of my own religion in time to come, let alone the form of the religion that I see and interact with in other people's religions. The second point is historic. That was the historical point. That all of our religions have evolved and will probably continue to evolve, and so we shouldn't be so stuck in our ways, as it were, to think that the way in which I do it is the only possible way to do it, or to think about it. Then there's the philosophical point, and here I'm going to get a little bit abstract, so hopefully it won't be too much. But if you think about a spectrum of positions in regard to what I can know. So let's say nihilism on one end of it. I can know nothing. There's really nothing, given the limits of human knowledge, there's really nothing that I can know. And if you want, some examples of that, I mean, if you want some, why would anybody think that? Well, I'll give you one reason for that. For the vast majority of human history, everybody, including the best scientists, thought that the world was flat, right? And now we think that the world is round. Who knows what the way we're going to think, with new things about, well, we had the Hubble telescope. Now we have a new thing out there that's going to tell us about how stars became what they did and all of that kind of thing, right? So nihilism would say anything you say is just for now, and it doesn't really have any lasting value whatsoever. Then moving along the spectrum, you have subjectivism. What I think is what I might think now, and it has no claim on what you think. Moving along the spectrum, you get to relativism. What is true is what we think is true, whoever the we is. It could be we Jews, it could be we Christians, we Muslims, we Buddhists, we secularists. What is true is whatever we think is true. On the very end of the spectrum is absolutism, that there is an absolute truth. And if you want to know what that is, just ask me, I'll tell you, okay? And I think in between relativism and absolutism is a view that I personally accept as a philosopher, sometimes called probabilism, sometimes called relativity. In other words, there probably is an absolute truth out there, but I can only know it from my own vantage point, or from our vantage point. That's the reason why I sometimes called relativity, very much like Einstein's notion of relativity, that we can only know about objects and forces from our own particular vantage point. That doesn't mean that those objects and forces don't exist and are not real. And similarly, if we're talking about religions, it doesn't mean that the ultimate reality that we are trying to capture is not real. It's just a figment of my imagination, or a figment of our imagination. No, it's real, okay, all right, but it is something that we can only know from our particular vantage point. And I think that kind of understanding of how we come to know things should first of all lead us to a stance of what I call epistemological humility, a certain humility about what we can know, and therefore a certain amount of respect for what other people claim that they know. And then we should then be able to talk with each other, in the Jewish tradition, argue with each other about what is true and good. And that's a way we respect each other. You don't, in the Jewish tradition, you don't respect other people by just accepting whatever they say. In the Jewish tradition, you respect somebody by taking their argument seriously and are willing to ask about it. And that doesn't mean you'll ultimately accept it. That doesn't mean that I, as a Jew, will become a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever, or a secularist, just because I'm listening to somebody who holds those positions, right? But I might learn from those positions and nevertheless be a committed conservative Jew. And as somebody who has done a lot of this kind of interfaith work and who has done a lot of work in secular philosophy, that's exactly where I am. This kind of epistemological humility, while at the same time very much believing in my own tradition and practicing it with seriousness, because I have, in my own limited way of understanding things, that's what seems to be true to me. Now, am I an objective observer? No, of course not. I don't think any human being is an objective observer. We all come into life, in our own particular families and faith traditions, and by the time we're able to think in these terms as adults, we are no longer objective observers. We began with our tradition, and we have a certain prejudice either toward or against it. I mean, there's some people who grow up in a given tradition and are really hate it, and so they're not an objective observer in that sense. But many of us who continue in the tradition in which we were raised, begin with a bias toward that tradition, and therefore need to get out of our epistemological box, as it were, and begin to learn from other people what they believe and why they believe it, in order to be able to learn more about our own tradition. Diana Eck, a professor at Harvard, has this wonderful line that somebody who knows only one tradition knows none, because you don't really know what the circumstances were that led to the development of your own tradition and why your ancestors chose the way of thinking and acting the way that they chose. So it's really important to, from an epistemological point of view, to have a certain humility about your own faith tradition and within your own faith tradition, and also to be able to learn from others about theirs. And then finally, an historical reason to be open to other faiths, and a philosophical reason. Finally, I think a theological reason. And here I'm really talking, I'm really talking from the Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition never believed that anybody who was not born Jewish has to become Jewish in order to do what God wants of him or her. The Jewish tradition believes that there is a covenant between God and the Jewish people, and that Jews are responsible for that covenant. That's 613 commandments by traditional count that God gave to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. But then anybody else is doing God's will if they abide by the 7 commandments given to Noah, called the Noahide covenant. All children of Noah, in other words, all human beings, are subject to those 7 commandments. But if you are not born Jewish and you're abiding by those 7 commandments, you're doing exactly what God wants of you. And as a matter of fact, traditionally, if you wanted to convert to Judaism, I, as a rabbi, had to try to dissuade you from doing that. To say to you, what do you want it for? I mean, you're doing whatever God wants of you by just abiding by the 7. You're going to have 613 if you do this. And aside from that, you're going to be subjected to a lot of the persecution, unfortunately, that Jews have suffered by Christians and Muslims historically. And so consequently, I have to try to dissuade you from converting. In the conservative and the reform movement these days, that's done less often. But on the other hand, none of us is missionary. None of the modern movements in Israel in modern Judaism is missionary in a way that Christianity has been and Islam has been historically. So that's the theological issue here, namely that that for Jews at least, we welcome the fact that non-Jews abide by these 7 commandments. By the way, there's 6 negative things and 1 positive thing. Against murder, idolatry, and sexual crimes of various sorts, incest and adultery primarily, and against taking a limb from a living animal. That's one of the negative things in the 7 commandments. Against blasphemy, against theft, and then so those are all negative commandments. And then the positive one is that you create a system of justice, and that it be a reasonable system of justice. So if anybody is following those 7 commandments, the 6 negative ones and the 1 positive one, you're doing whatever God wants. And consequently, the openness of the Jewish tradition to listening to others and to learning from others is very much theologically based in our tradition. Now, of course, at different times in history, if Jews have been persecuted, we're not going to be very interested in what our persecutors are doing to us, right? Or what leads them to persecute us, right? Or kill us. But that said, in modern times, especially in places like the United States with freedom of religion, or any of the Western countries with freedom of religion, we are very much interested in interfaith dialogue, of which this is a part. I'm going to stop here, by the way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dorff. We call this series Beyond Tolerance, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theologies of interfaith hospitality, and you have certainly provided a rich table of food for thought for us to feast on. And so I would like to begin with our respondents first, to ask questions, comments, share impressions with you. And why don't we start with Kinan, if you would, Kinan Tawil.
Thank you, Reinhard. Thank you, Dr. Dorff, for your presentation. I had 2 questions that came to mind, but the first one that I'll start with is, so you mentioned how anyone, even if they're not Jewish, if they follow the 7 commandments of Noah, they're doing God's will. And I wonder if that question, that concept that they're doing God's will, if they follow these 7 commandments, is there any connection there with Judaism's view of their salvation, let's say in the hereafter?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the Talmud says very explicitly, the righteous of the world, that is, those people who follow these commandments, have a place in the world to come. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. And then you also alluded to Nostra Aetate, Vatican II, and the Lutheran Church's similar declarations. I wonder, have there been any such declarations from the Jewish community on its views of other faith communities?
Yeah, we start with the rabbis of the Talmud already, right? The whole idea of the Noahide covenant. By the way, if you read the Bible, you won't find that there, okay? This is the way in which the rabbis interpreted, the rabbis of the Talmud interpreted one verse actually in Genesis. That then created. So this is a rabbinic doctrine, and Judaism, every one of the 3 Western traditions is a tradition. That is, it's based on a scripture that is then interpreted and applied over time by both the authorities of that tradition as well as the people who observe it. Right. So in our case, rabbis and Jews. In the Christian case, the church fathers originally, and then whoever is, whatever denomination you're in. I mean, it's either the Pope and the priest if you're a Catholic, or whoever the minister is in your particular denomination, if you're a Christian, together with the people, right? Because every tradition is an interaction between the authorities of that tradition and the people who are trying to observe it. And there's always that kind of mutual interaction. Or if you're Muslim, originally between Muhammad and his disciples, right? And then between the imams of today, and whether it be Sunni or Shiite or whatever, right? So the I mean, so it begins with the rabbis who basically created this doctrine, and then in more recent times you get various kinds of statements. By the way, in all three denominations, three of the major denominations in American Judaism, where the Orthodox will talk about the degree to which they will interact with non-Jewish clergy, some more, some less. And within the conservative movement and within the reform movement more, truthfully. And you get things like Dabru Emet, which was a statement that came out in the early 2000s, which was precisely in response to what you're asking about, namely contemporary Jews talking about how does the Jewish tradition understand in that case in particular Christianity, right? Dabru Emet means speak truth. And it was an attempt to try to do what Vatican II had done for the Catholics vis-a-vis Jews, to do in the reverse direction for Jews vis-a-vis Christians. We have not really done that with Muslims. And by the way, I think that's a major task that we have yet to do.
Thank you.
The document that Dr. Dorff is referring to is also posted on our website if you want to read it and have a look at it.
And so is a section of chapter 3 of To Do the Right and the Good. It's also on the website of the Academy of Judaic-Christian and Islamic Studies.
Thank you, Kenan and Dr. Dorff. Can we continue with Casey Crouch from a Christian perspective? How did this strike you as a practicing Christian?
Yeah, well, Dr. Dorff, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot. And one thing that really caught my ear that I'd like to know a little bit more about is the dissuading people from converting to Judaism. From a Christian background, evangelism is it's big. And so, yeah, so they're not going to turn anyone away. I know that in Roman Catholicism, maybe there's a bit of time it takes, but they're definitely not going to try to dissuade you. So can you just talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was both theologically based and frankly, politically based. Theologically, because from the very beginning, the earliest sources that we have, in terms of the earliest rabbinic sources that we have, is that the Torah was given to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, right? And it was for the Jewish people. It was not really for anybody else. And the rabbis really interpret it that way from the very earliest rabbinic sources. So, for example, you have a line in Exodus chapter 30 about the Sabbath, Shabbat, right? It's between me and the people of Israel, right? And the rabbis say between me and the people of Israel and not anybody else. So, so we Jews are responsible for observing the many laws about Shabbat, whereas non-Jews are not, which leads to a very interesting sort of question in Jewish law. Well, may a non-Jew work for a Jew on Shabbat, right? Given the fact that non-Jews are not responsible for observing Shabbat. And then it becomes very complicated very fast, as usual, in the Jewish tradition. Namely, well, if you hired the person before Shabbat, and this was an ongoing thing, and the person decided they wanted to do the job on Shabbat, then you can do it, but you can't ask them to do it. A Jew may not ask a non-Jew to do it on Shabbat, because then, you're effectively hiring somebody on Shabbat, which you're not allowed to do, right? So, I mean, so that's just one example of that. So, I mean, I think that the theological piece of this is that from the very beginning, the covenant was between God and the Jewish people, and that was really not intended for anyone else. Non-Jews may convert to Judaism, and we have that from the Book of Ruth, for example, right? Your God is my God, and your Naomi, Ruth says to Naomi, your God is my God, and your people is my people. So we've had conversion from biblical times, but I think the reason why it was discouraged over time was first because of this theological thing, but I think also, frankly, a historical thing, namely. After the destruction of the Second Temple, Jews were living among Christians and Muslims, and they made it very clear that if we tried to missionize among them, off with your head, frankly. And so that was, and we were simply tolerated, at best tolerated, among Muslims and Christians. By the way, more tolerated historically among Muslims than by Christians. We were dhimmi, right? Christians and Jews were, were second-class citizens, and we're basically tolerated at best, persecuted at worst. And so so there's a very, very clear, what shall I say, reality reason as to why we were not missionizing. We wanted to stay alive. It's as simple as that. Okay.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Illuminating on a theological as well as practical level.
Right.
So thank you, Casey, for that insightful question. Eliana, you are preparing to be a rabbi and have taken classes with Dr. Dorff. Do you agree with everything he says, or do you have questions?
No, she's a Jew. She's not going to agree with everything.
We say two Jews, three
opinions. I asked this question in the way I did.
Yeah. So whether I agree with myself or whether Rabbi Dorff agrees with himself is also open for debate, I would guess. I both really, really appreciate the theological standpoint, Rabbi Dorff, that you're coming from, and especially the emphasis, and having had you as a teacher also just know that this is part of who you are as a person and a teacher, on that epistemic humility, the notion that like no one of us can really know everything. So and I think what you said about the no-hide laws and how they function theologically is really important. And a question that I've had as we were discussing is about the way that like practically the Judaism as a lived religion has interacted with religious others, not just in moments of persecution, right, where wanting to take some distance is of course understandable, but we have a lot of dietary laws, and among them are laws that are for are prohibitions on certain kinds of food, right? Like the Bible says you can't have fish that doesn't have fins and scales. So, like I wouldn't eat shellfish. But the rabbis added on to that preparer-based prohibitions on food, prohibitions about not eating the bread of non-Jews, or the oil, or drinking wine. That's a little bit of a separate issue because of the issue of libation at a sort of particular historical moment, and idolatry. But those preparer-based prohibitions remain for many, many Jewish communities. Won't eat food that was cooked on a stove if a Jew didn't light the stove. So I'm curious how those the ways that we distanced ourselves from other communities, from like being able to sit down and share a meal together, which is sort of the core of what interfaith hospitality actually can look like, not just from a theological perspective, but from a sort of intimate perspective. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
So the prohibitions that you're talking about happened after the destruction of the Second Temple, when the rabbis were really worried about Jews just simply disappearing, because Jews were, well, certainly not immediately after the destruction of the Second Temple, but after the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 135, you had the Hadrianic persecutions, in which it became a capital offense to teach Judaism, right? So it was not a pleasant time for Jews, and it was quite possible that Jews would just try to assimilate, so they wouldn't be subjected to this kind of persecution, right? So what the rabbis tried to do was to sort of buttress the walls, as it were, within the Jewish community, so that if Jews did not eat the bread of non-Jews, or drink the wine of non-Jews, or use their oil, that would be a way of preventing assimilation. That's really what they were after. And that gets then changed a lot after the Enlightenment, and I think the Enlightenment has led to a major shift in all of these kinds of things, right? But even during the Middle Ages, you you get questions about the status of non-Jews, right? So Maimonides, for example, 12th century, has no problem whatsoever in understanding Muslims as being monotheists. He does have problems about Christians being monotheists because of the Trinity, right? But I do a lot of interfaith work with Christians, and even you guys say that it's a mystery as to how three can be one and one three and all of that. So if you think it's a mystery, what do you want from me, right? But it's but the thing is that it's so I mean, there were those kinds of theological issues, right? But there was always because we didn't missionize, Jews have always been a very small population. I mean, just to give you a sense of that now, we are 0.2% of the world's population. Christians are about 1/3 of the world's population. Muslims about 22% of the world's population, right? We are 0.2% of the world's population, and there's a real, and with freedom, that came with the Enlightenment, it came assimilation, and so we are really worried about interfaith marriage. And by the way, that's not, that if you have encountered that in the Jewish community, it's not because we don't appreciate Christianity for what it is or Islam for what it is. It's that we're just trying to survive as a Jewish tradition. And when Jews who marry non-Jews are a very small minority of them raise their children as Jews. So that's the reason why we are so worried about interfaith marriages between Jews and non-Jews, right? But that comes out of these kinds of sociological realities that led to the prohibitions you're talking about, and back in the 2nd century, and still are some things that are really problematic. And so, how do you have a meal that's not kosher, that's not certified kosher, with people who are not obligated to observe those laws in the first place, right? It's a problem that all Jews have that are in any way, shape, or form traditional. Now, if you're asking, do I have meals with non-Jews in non-kosher restaurants? Sure, I do. But I don't have shrimp, or I don't have shellfish, or I don't have meat. I'm a veggie anyway, so it's become much easier, frankly, since I became a veggie back in 1986. But so I mean, but I'm compromising on the preparation issues. I know I am. Right? And there's some Jews who will only eat cold things because of that, like tuna salad or something like that, right? I personally will eat, I will have a vegetarian pizza, okay? Not terribly, not without some guilt, I'll say, okay? But that's the compromise that I've made. But I grew up in Milwaukee where there were no kosher restaurants whatsoever. And I went to public schools, right? So if I was going to have any kind of social life whatsoever, I had to get used to eating vegetarian things with Jews and non-Jews who were eating, well, actually, when I was a teenager, the new place in town was Big Boy. That was cheeseburgers, right? But when I went to Big Boy, I got a fish sandwich or a salad or something stupid like that, right? And my non-Jewish friends thought it was cool because I had principles. My Jewish friends thought it was medieval, but that's a whole other story. Okay.
So, thank you for that illuminating answer to a very perceptive question. And it also alludes to what you were saying earlier, that religions evolve, maybe even in one's own lifetime.
Right.
So I want to give Dr. Rifi a chance to comment and ask a question. So what came to your mind during Dr. Dorff's presentation?
Thank you, Reinhard. And thank you, Dr. Dorff. I appreciate this dialogue, and it's a definitely enlightening discussion. A comment and a question. I mean, thank God Muslims stand in the middle. We do not actively try to convert people, but we certainly do not try not to have them convert. There's no compulsion in religion, and people are free to pick whatever religion that will connect them to God. So you mentioned Western religions, and you referred to the Abrahamic faith as Western religions. I beg to differ, because all Abrahamic faiths came from the Middle East, and I don't see the Middle East as the West. But again, that's a point of discussion that we can take at another time. But my question is, it relates to the comment that you mentioned, that there has to be changes in religion over time for religion to be relevant. How do you, what kind of changes from a Judaic perspective that you see that has to happen or is happening within Judaism for Judaism to be relevant? And how do you equate that with the fact that God Almighty, who sent us these religions, who meant it for all times, and God knows best. God knew, because we're His creation. He knew what kind of changes people would want, or the religion that connects them back to God would be there throughout the time. So what kind of changes from a Judaic perspective, and how do you see that with the fact that God Almighty, who knows all, is the one who created us and He sent us those messages and created the change that happened throughout time?
Fine, good, thank you. So on the linguistic point, I just accept it. I'm old, and when I was at Columbia in the 1960s, it was the Western religions and, get this, Oriental religions. And actually, we had 3 books: India, China, and Japan. And it was the Department of Oriental Religions at Columbia at the time, as opposed to Asian religions. And if you want to talk about Middle Eastern religions, I'm with you. You're absolutely right. Historically, that's where we came from. So my apologies. It's just a function of my old age. In terms of changes, well, let me give you some examples. Eliana is going to be a rabbi. That did not exist in Judaism until the late 20th century, actually. And that was the place of women within Judaism. And by the way, even increasingly within Orthodoxy, is changing a lot. There are a lot of Orthodox synagogues now that have something like they call it a bat mitzvah. Now, it's not the same thing that happens in the conservative movement, where a girl may and girls do the same kinds of things that boys do on their bar mitzvah, right? In most synagogues, and it all depends upon what parts of the service the young bar bat mitzvah can do and wants to do, but it's not a matter of what gender you are, right? Now that's, the first bat mitzvah in the world was 1922 by Mordechai Kaplan for his daughter. And when I was that age, I was in a conservative synagogue where a girl did most of what most boys did. That is, she said Kiddush on Friday night and was called to the Torah and read the Haftarah, the section from the prophets, and gave a homily. Right, that's what most boys did. But if she wanted to lead the service, that was not allowed. If she wanted to read Torah, that was not allowed in 1956 when I was bar mitzvah. I'm 78. You don't have to do the math. The thing is that but that has changed radically now in conservative synagogues, and even in Orthodox synagogues, you're now beginning to get this thing called, they don't call them rabbis, but they have people who are ordained, that is, or are doing virtually whatever all the male rabbis are doing, right? So those are some major changes. I do a lot of bioethics. Let me tell you, there's a lot of stuff that has happened in medicine over the last 50 years, and that has required all of our traditions to apply our traditions to modern circumstances. So, to things like infertility treatments, things like heart-lung machines, organ transplants, all of that stuff, right? Which didn't exist at the time of any of our scriptures. And so, you need to, the traditions need to simply respond to modern circumstances, right? Similarly, in terms of whoever talked about having a class on Zoom before a couple of years ago, right? Or whoever talked about doing business on the internet until 30 years ago, at the very earliest, right? And so what constitutes a deal in Islamic law or in Jewish law or in Christian understanding of things, right? So, I mean, all of these things just need to be, need to be dealt with by each of these traditions. And in doing so, you're immediately stretching the tradition. I mean, objectively, you are stretching the tradition. Otherwise, it becomes irrelevant to a lot of areas of human life, right? And I suggest to you that every single tradition does it. Exactly how open they are about the fact that they are doing it is another matter, right? I mean, they may say, well, I mean, let me take my own tradition. Among the Orthodox, most of them will say, well, all of these new interpretations were already inherent in the Torah that God gave at Sinai, right? So, and they will quote one of the things in the Talmud, which is actually the Palestinian Talmud, which is that every question that a student was going to ask his or her rabbi for all ages to come was already embedded in the Torah itself, right? So the question you just asked me, right, that was already in the Torah. Okay, now I have to tell you, I don't think so. Okay, but the point is that it's so that's what I mean. It depends upon how open you are to the fact that what's going on here is a real adaptation and application of your tradition to modern circumstances, right? And I think I personally want to be very open about that, and very open about the historical fact that that happened. And I think that that there's no point in not doing so. Now, the authority question that you're asking, God gave us the Torah after all. So how is what if I write a given rabbinic ruling about, you name it, I don't know. Well, let's take a recent one, violent and defamatory video games. Now, let me just tell you, video games did not exist at the time of the Torah, right? They did not exist until when? Whatever, Atari, I think. Remember, 1980 or something? Right. Okay. So now some of them are really very educational. Some of the video games, some of them are just fun, but some of them are violent and defamatory, especially against women, by the way. And so, what does that mean in terms of how you take Jewish sensitivities and apply them, and Jewish morals, really, and laws, and apply them to that circumstance? It would be easy if you could say that everybody who plays those things then goes out and does those terrible things, kills people, rapes people, all of that, right? But 99% of the people who play those games don't do them. So what is your objection to them, right? And believe me, I have objections to them. So that had to be worked out very carefully. And that was applying Jewish moral understandings of character, really, to this modern thing. And see, in my tradition, that's really easy to justify, because the rabbis themselves say that God, after all, Deuteronomy 17, when you have a question in your generation, you go to the judge of your generation, and the judge of your generation will tell you what to do. And if you don't abide by what the judge says, the penalty is death. So they took, ongoing interpretation really seriously. And the rabbis will say that there are 70 faces to the Torah. That's just a big number. 70 ways in which any text in the Torah can be interpreted, right? And you can't become a rabbi until you, in the tradition, until you can make a creepy crawly thing, which is unkosher, until you can find 49 reasons why it should be kosher. Okay, this is now, I mean, that's an exaggeration, obviously, but the point is that the way that the rabbis understood the tradition is in a non-fundamentalist way. That's my point here, right? They understood it as being open to interpretation, and that and they even tell a story that that if you don't do it that way, then God is not happy with you, because God intended it to be interpreted and applied over time, right? So that's why Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues will reveal things that were not revealed to Moses and his colleagues. That's what the Talmud says, right? And that ongoing revelation has to occur in our time as well. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I appreciate that. And I only asked the question because I wanted to see how from a Judaic perspective, how that change is viewed. Because, again, as a Muslim, you mentioned it could be already in the Talmud. In Islam, everything is permissible unless it is specifically prohibited.
Yeah.
So that really gives a wide window for interpretation to
Right.
what is best for humanity.
Yeah. By the way, we have the exact same thing, and Islam in particular has a very rich legal tradition. And one of our mutual friends, Muzamil Siddiqui, was the head of the Fiqh Council, right? I happen to be the chair of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement, right? And so we share a lot about this kind of legal development that occurs in both of our traditions.
Thank you.
Sure.
Question, because all of our traditions believe in revelation, namely that God has spoken in the midst of history in some kind of absolute sense, right? And then at the same time, you talk about adapting it to the times. And the question, it's a fine dance. The question is, when does the adaptation lose the core of the revelation?
Right.
That is, I think, the question we are wrestling with. Yes, it needs to adapt. My question to you would be, you, I think, are very convincing in your argument of saying that religions evolve historically. We have some different understandings, for example, about slavery than our traditions held several hundred years ago. If that's the case, if religion evolves based on your epistemological model, is religion getting more true and more moral?
Oh, actually, the Reform movement, the classical Reform movement, believed that. They believed in what they call progressive revelation. That is that that we now, because we have all of our history behind us, we know more about what is right and wrong than our ancestors did. That was the early Reform movement. The current Reform movement, I think, doesn't believe that anymore. In the conservative movement, we believe in continuous revelation, right? Now, sometimes, most of the time, the general rule in the conservative movement is that we are a traditional movement. So the burden of proof is on anyone who wants to change the tradition, right? We believe that the tradition stands unless there's a very good reason to change it. And the burden of proof is on anyone who wants to change it. But it is open to change. And I've given you some examples of that, especially when you're applying things to new circumstances, but sometimes even when, women have been around since the dawn of humanity, and their place in society has changed rather radically in our time, right? So it's not just new technology, it's just new understandings of things, new social circumstances, by the way, new educational circumstances. I think a large part of that is that women are getting the same education that was only open to men traditionally. I think that's a very large part of the changes in women's status, at least in my tradition. So I mean, I think that those kinds of things are just sort of inherent in the tradition in that way. Now, Reinhard, remind me of your question. I'm sorry. How did I get here?
Whether as we debate and argue and adapt our religious tradition to changing circumstances and new questions come up, and we learn from each other as well,
Right.
across religious boundaries, do religions get more true and more moral?
Oh, right. Yes.
Namely closer to what God had in mind.
Well, I'll just say I hope so, but I can't guarantee it because, after all, I have limited knowledge, right? And all kidding aside, I mean, I have written a number of rabbinic rulings. They're called tshuvot, answers to questions. And what is very consciously in my mind when I write one of these things is two things. Number one, the legal parts of it, namely, how am I going to connect whatever it is that I'm saying to the tradition as it has come down to us, right? Because I very much want the tradition to be part of my life and the life of my community, right? So part of it is the legal techniques of analogizing things to times before, differentiating or distinguishing things. This is first-year law students who learn this kind of thing all the time, namely, how do you analogize things or distinguish things from precedents, okay? But the other thing that, all kidding aside, is really very much prominent in my mind is how is my understanding of God such that God would want it the way that I'm proposing? And within, so in other words, I take the theological piece of this very seriously. And fortunately, within my movement, there is a committee on Jewish law and standards consisting of 25 rabbis, 5 lay people, and a cantor. Sometimes I'll just say, sometimes I've written a ruling, and in order to be considered to be a validated option within the conservative movement, it has to get at least 6 votes out of the 25 rabbis, right? And I have, how do I know? Sometimes the way I put it to my students is, how do I know that something that I've written is nothing less than what God wants of us in our time, as opposed to another one of Dorff's crazy ideas? The answer is 6 votes. Okay. Right. And let me just say, I've written something that did not get 6 votes, and most of it. And I've written something more recently, by the way, on aid and dying, that got 9 votes with 6 votes against and a number of abstentions. Right. So so I mean, and I personally agree with that vote. In other words, I think it's not at all a slam dunk as to whether we should be doing aid and dying. And I'm really glad that my colleagues, had a very vigorous debate about it. Okay. Some of the things I've done have gotten almost unanimous things, but and some of them just barely. I mean, when we first were talking about the status of gays and lesbians, this goes back to 2000, well, it goes back originally to 1992, and then redone again in 2003 to 2006. The ultimate vote was, there were primarily two different responses on the table. One that would say we should not allow gay or lesbian weddings or gay or lesbian people to be ordained as rabbis. And that one got 13 votes out of the 25. And then there was one that I was part of with 2 other rabbis that said that gave reasons why we should allow that. And that also got 13 votes. And you ask, how come? Well, because one of the members of the committee decided to vote for both of them because he wanted pluralism within the movement on this issue. Okay. Now that was back in 2006. I think if the votes were taken now, there would be many more in favor of allowing, because we've had allowing for conservative rabbis to officiate at gay or lesbian weddings, at same-sex weddings, than there were back in 2006. And part of that is what's happened in America since then, right? Including Supreme Court decisions here, because, I mean, we don't live in a vacuum, we Jews, right? We live in a community, nor do Muslims or Christians, right? We live in a community and we're very much influenced by what's going on in our world, right? Including what's going on socially and morally, as well as scientifically and technologically. And I would argue that the same sort of thing was true in antiquity, right? That part of what was going on there was a function of what was going on in their world. I mean, I'll just tell you straight out, a lot of Jewish marriage law, and for that matter, business law, was a direct borrowing from Roman law.
Your answer for me just now raises a whole host of other questions, and I wish we could continue. It also reminded me when you talked about rabbinic rulings that you write about the verse in Acts, which is one of the books in the New Testament, after there was a major disagreement in the early church, and they wrote a ruling that they sent then to the congregations around the Mediterranean of the earliest Christians, and it starts with the sentence, "The Holy Spirit and we decided."
Nice.
So
yes.
That is quite
yes.
a confident move and saying
That's
this
right.
is binding. So
right. And I told you that I'm co-chair of the priest-rabbi dialogue. And one of my priest friends said, whenever the church is making a major change, the document always starts out as the church has always taught. Right? As soon as you see that, you know that something really revolutionary is coming. Right?
I can't believe we're at the end of the time. I want to seriously thank you for a very enlightening conversation that leaves us a lot of food for thought. I would like to thank everybody for contributing, illuminating, discerning questions, comments. Next week, we're going to continue with the contours of what a Christian theology of interfaith hospitality might look like. And then in the third week, Mr. Rifi will give us an outline of the Muslim perspective on this issue, how Muslims are to treat and engage people of other faiths. So stay tuned, but for today, thank you for watching, and goodbye and stay well.